On 5 News, finally, the truth about the Iraq War. The invasion was based on flawed evidence. It was poorly planned, and it needn't have happened.
In March 2003, there was no imminent threat from Saddam Hussein.
Tony Blair insists his decision was right. The world is better and safer, he says. But today, he also said sorry.
I express more sorrow, regret, and apology than you may ever know or can believe.
For those whose loved ones never return from the conflict, though, there's anger.
There is one terrorist in this world that the world needs to be aware of, and his name's Tony Blair, the world's worst terrorist.
7 years in the writing, more than 2.5 million words. It's a scathing verdict on the war in Iraq. We'll be asking what happens now. Also this evening, Oscar Pistorius is sentenced to 6 years behind bars for murdering his girlfriend. And a moment in history for Welsh fans as their team go for glory in tonight's Euro 2016 semi-final. Hello and welcome to 5 News. I'm Sian Williams. He delivered his findings quietly, but they were damning. After 7 years examining the evidence into the Iraq War, Sir John Chilcot concluded today that the invasion was based on flawed intelligence and went badly wrong, with consequences to this day. This is what the report says. The UK went to war before all peaceful options had been exhausted. War was not a last resort. The then Prime Minister Tony Blair made a case about Iraq's weapons of mass destruction with a certainty that was not justified. It says the UK's actions undermined the authority of the UN Security Council, and the legal basis for war was far from satisfactory. The report says armed forces had little time to prepare and were left with equipment shortfalls. And it said plans and preparations for Iraq after Saddam Hussein were wholly inadequate. Well, today, Tony Blair said the decision was his most agonising moment, but he still believes it was right. The reaction from family shortly. First, though, here's our political editor, Andy Bell.
It was the job of this unassuming committee to pass the definitive judgment on the most divisive British war of modern times, and the chairman delivered a central, damning verdict.
We have concluded that the UK chose to join the invasion of Iraq before the peaceful options for disarmament had been exhausted. Military action at that time was not a last resort. Military action in Iraq might have been necessary at some point, but in March 2003, there was no imminent threat from Saddam Hussein.
That war will always be his legacy. But what does the report say today on 3 specific questions? Did he do a secret deal with President Bush? At George Bush's Texas home in April 2002, the report says Tony Blair offered the president a partnership to deal urgently with Saddam Hussein. But it does not say there was any secret arrangement. Later that year, Tony Blair sent the president this note, kept classified until now, saying he would be with the president whatever. The report says that note made it very difficult for the UK to withdraw support for US action. Did he lie about weapons of mass destruction? The report says there's no evidence Number 10 improperly influenced the text of the infamous WMD dossier, so no sexing up. But when Tony Blair presented the information, for instance, to Parliament,
his weapons of mass destruction programme is active, detailed and growing.
It says he deliberately selected information to reflect what he believed rather than the intelligence judgments. Was the war legal? The report says it's not part of its brief to declare on the legality of the war, but it does say the way the Attorney General, Lord Goldsmith, decided it was legal was far from satisfactory. And it also says the way Britain abandoned a second UN resolution while pushing for war undermined the United Nations.
In the absence of a majority in support of military action, we consider that the UK was, in fact, undermining the Security Council's authority.
Today, an older and it seemed at times emotional Tony Blair went further than ever before in apologising for what happened.
I feel deeply and sincerely, in a way that no words can properly convey, the grief and suffering of those who lost ones they loved in Iraq. For all of this, I express more sorrow, regret, and apology than you may ever know or can believe.
Over almost 2 hours, he accepted there were real criticisms on planning and preparation. But facing the media, he defended his decision.
I can look not just the families of this country, but the nation in the eye and say, I did not mislead this country. I made the decision in good faith on the information I had at the time. And I believe that it is better that we took that decision. I acknowledge all the problems that came with that decision. I acknowledge the mistakes and accept responsibility for them. What I cannot do and will not do is say I believe we took the wrong decision.
Tony Blair!
Shame on you!
Tony Blair!
Shame on you!
But they do not believe that decision was taken in good faith, and this report has only sharpened their condemnation.
Well, the families of some of those British servicemen and women who were killed during the war were watching Sir John Chilcot as he delivered his verdict. Listening to his finding was gut-wrenching, they said, and they felt anger that their sons and daughters had died in vain. They blamed one man, Tony Blair. Catherine Jones reports.
179 British servicemen and women lost their lives fighting in Iraq. Many of their families have fought for years to learn the truth about why we went to war there. Today, they got their answers.
What have been your abiding emotions this morning as you have read those 180 or so pages?
Anger. That healing, that 11 and a half years I've worked for. I've gone back to that time when I learned that my brother had been killed. And there is one terrorist in this world that the world needs to be aware of, and his name is Tony Blair, the world's worst terrorist.
Sarah's brother, Sergeant Bob O'Connor, was killed in 2005 when his Hercules aircraft was shot down. For her, Sir John Chilcot has delivered what the families wanted.
As everybody started to read, and it went quiet, and then there was just, oh my God, oh my God, and then there were lines, utter devastation, utter devastation. But, yeah, he's done good for our boys and girls.
But it's not over. The families and their lawyers are to forensically examine the report to work out if any official or politician can be taken to court to answer for their actions. Peter Brierley lost his son Sean right at the start of the Iraq War. He feels he owes it to him to keep fighting.
He would have been the one stood in front of Downing Street tearing up the papers and throwing the medals down because he believed in fairness and injustice. If he thought that we'd been led, especially the fact that so many people died, so much the country were ruined. Had he known that, he would have been stood there outside of me.
Sean's coffin was one of the first to be flown home 13 years ago. So many more followed. The families feel finally they've been heard, but that doesn't ease the pain of their loss. Catherine Jones, 5 News.
Andy, a truly damning indictment of the lead-up to the Iraq War. But as Cathy says, it's not over yet. So what's likely to happen next?
It is an absolutely damning indictment, but the one thing this report did not do is say explicitly that Tony Blair was a liar. It did not say that there was some kind of secret conspiracy with George Bush always to go to war. It did not say that the war was illegal. In other words, it did not say anywhere that Tony Blair is a war criminal. And a lot of people who are opponents of the war still want to explore if there is some way whereby Tony Blair can be brought to the dock. And as we heard today from lawyers for some of the bereaved families, they are going away now to explore what legal options there may be to keep up their pursuit of Tony Blair.
Andy, thank you. Well, Sir John Chilcot did praise one group of people in the Iraq War, the men and women who were sent to fight there. But he said they got such little support from ministers and MOD officials in Whitehall, their effort never met the scale of the challenge. They also faced a lack of equipment that should not have been tolerated. Here's Simon Vigar.
Pushed up, lads. Come on. Send me shoulder. It's all right. Keep this up. Get it off.
Under-resourced before the war, not listened to during it. Chilcot finds the British Army was let down. The most obvious example, the Land Rovers, which left soldiers fatally exposed to roadside bombs.
It is not clear which person or department within the Ministry of Defence was responsible for identifying and articulating such capability gaps, but it should have been.
Colonel Chris Parker was Chief of Staff of the Desert Rats. He says the situation was a disgrace.
Whole units had no desert combats, which is particularly difficult. The engineers were operating in black boots, which were melting on the vehicles that they were operating on because of the heat. I went to war with 9 bullets. So there were a lot of failings here which were causing high risk to life, and that focuses people's minds pretty quickly.
Tony Blair visited Basra shortly after the British took control.
When people look back on this time and look back on this conflict, I honestly believe they will see this as one of the defining moments of our century.
Away from the cameras, Colonel Parker briefed the Prime Minister and soon realised Mr Blair was surrounded by yes men.
What the hell was going on between the Prime Minister and myself that when we met, all those staff, 1,000 people, there must have been in the line between me and him, what were they saying to either dilute what we were reporting on a daily basis to make sure that there was this abject indifference and failure going on?
4 years of anarchy and ambushes led to a hasty retreat in 2007.
The UK military role in Iraq ended a very long way from success.
Chris Parker was long gone by that point, but his views reflect the bitterness felt across the army.
What we can't understand is the reason why we were all there and the justification for all this blood and treasure that we lost as a nation and reputational loss. Someone's got to be accountable, and it certainly shouldn't be the boys and girls in green, because I think they did a sterling job.
The Chilcot report agrees. Indeed, the troops are about the only people to emerge from all this with any credit. Simon Vigar, 5 News.
Sir John Chilcot said in his report that the decision to invade Iraq has consequences to this day among families who've lost those they love and in places where extremism thrives and the death tolls rise. You only have to look at Iraq today to know what he means. The number of people killed in the bomb attack in Baghdad at the weekend has now reached 250. Julian Drucker reports.
In Baghdad, there isn't time to contemplate the recriminations of 2003. Not when they're mourning the blood that was shed just 3 days ago. Today, Muslims, both Sunni and Shia, held a memorial vigil for the 250 killed. Sunday's atrocity was the worst to hit the city since the war, and is now one of the deadliest terror attacks in history. The self-proclaimed Islamic State claimed responsibility, just one of the terror groups whose formation can be traced back to the chaotic fallout from the Iraq conflict.
The war allowed Al-Qaeda to flourish. It created the situation in which such an extremist movement could garner support. Of course, this led to the establishment of ISIS. That Blair himself was warned by the Joint Intelligence Committee very clearly that this would be the case. He should have known many of the consequences of such a war, but he chose to ignore them or push them aside.
Iraq has shaped recent history in the Middle East. In Afghanistan, like Iraq, insurgents filled a power vacuum and attacked UK and US troops. Libya watched the fall of Saddam and toppled its despot with help from the West. And the decision not to put British boots on the ground in Syria was guided by the UK's Iraq intervention. An intervention which this woman in Baghdad told us she regrets.
Tony Blair is apologizing and saying it's a mistake. First, thank you for doing that, but that story is not going to bring everybody died during these years back to life. And now we're paying for it. We're paying with the blood for it.
The events of 13 years ago being felt today. The Iraq legacy and its unintended consequences. Julian Drucker, 5 News.
Still to come on the programme. No more house arrest. Oscar Pistorius is sent back to jail for the murder of his girlfriend. And can they do it? Wales fans dare to dream of a place in the finals. All that and more after the break. Welcome back. You're watching 5 News. More reaction to the Iraq war report shortly. First, though, some other news. And Oscar Pistorius has been sentenced to 6 years in jail after his conviction for killing his girlfriend, Riva Steenkamp, was upgraded to murder. The South African could have faced up to 15 years, but the judge said there were a number of mitigating circumstances. His lawyers say they won't appeal, although prosecutors could still challenge the sentence. In Wales, they call it Hwyl, a spirit or passion which has seen the Welsh team through to the semi-finals of Euro 2016. In just a few hours, they face Portugal for the coveted place in the final. And fans hope that whatever happens in that 90 minutes, the squad will show the same heart and determination that's already delighted a nation and inspired many more. Peter Lane reports now from Lyon.
Eyes on the prize as Lyon plays host to Welsh football's watershed moment. Brothers Martin and Richard drove for 14 hours to be part of it.
It'll be longer on the way back if we lose. If we win,
we're not going to lose. We're not going to lose.
Down in the city centre, the colour of Wales and Portugal shirts, the air of expectation. Ahead of the match, we found Arfan and Mark on the tourist trail at the Roman Theatre. Arfan minus his wife, who had to go home to Wales after breaking her leg.
We had to come back early.
So she's at home with a broken leg and you're here?
I am, yes. I'm very grateful for allowing me to come back.
Now, as much as tonight is about the spectacle of the two countries facing each other, it's also about the theatre, the high drama of their star names. Cristiano Ronaldo versus Gareth Bale, teammates at Real Madrid, rivals tonight. So, how do the Galacticos line up? Well, Ronaldo's transfer fee was £80 million. Bale's was £85 million, making him the world's most expensive player. Ronaldo earns more, though. In the last year alone, his wages and commercial deals were £67 million compared to Bale's £27 million. And he's got more Twitter followers, 43.8 million to Bale's 8.5 million. But he's scored 2 goals this tournament, outnumbered by Bale's 3. Today we spotted these fans carrying a big box of beers and carrying hopes and dreams as they headed towards the biggest footballing moment Wales has ever seen. Peter Lane, 5 News, Lyon.
Let's go back now to our main story. Whatever lessons can be learned from the Iraq War, for so many, its consequences are profound and lasting. Ryan Hall was deployed to Iraq twice. The horrors he witnessed leading to him being diagnosed with post-traumatic stress disorder. Maureen Shearer lost her son Richard, killed by a roadside bomb in July 2005. Here, they both give their personal account of the war.
It was a Saturday morning. I turned on the television and immediately the news came up that 3 soldiers had been killed. And I just knew then. We'd had scares before, but this time I was terrified. I just knew that it was him. The vehicles weren't fit for purpose. They were old vehicles that had been used. Reece said on his last leave they spent most of their time just trying to keep them on the road. They were working on them non-stop virtually. And I learnt that a device should have been triggered to warn them that there was an explosion on the side of the road, and it didn't happen. And they drove into it. They failed in their duty of care to the soldiers.
I was deployed to Iraq in 2004, 2005, and subsequently in 2006, 2007. One half of me was very reluctant to be in a situation where my moral code would be stretched. And then the other part is the soldier, which does what he's told to do and follows orders and doesn't ask questions. But it did have an impact. When you have a pre-scheduled meeting with a friend and then you go to meet that friend and he's died overnight. Bombardment and the damage and the casualties that it's causing, it does have an impact. I first became aware of the possibility of service-related PTSD very recently. How it manifests itself day to day is the perception that people are trying to kill me or my friends. Very clear, vivid nightmares and very specific to the feeling and the emotions of being there, which is very strange.
I border on hate with Tony Blair. He was responsible for taking us into Iraq, for the soldiers being killed, for not looking after them. He didn't have a plan for when we left Iraq. The Iraqi people weren't looked after. It's chaos, and it's still chaos there.
We can see the mistakes that were made, and I think that it's important for him as an individual and for us all collectively to use this terrible experience and to learn from it.
When you lose a child, it's with you all the time, constantly, and it doesn't get any better. You try and put it in a sort of compartment so it doesn't hurt so much, but there are anniversaries and birthdays and so forth, and it's just with you all the time, you know, what might have been.
Maureen Shearer, the mother of Second Lieutenant Richard Shearer and Ryan Hall, who served in Iraq. Well, Matt's joined us, and you have a special programme on the Chilcot Report tonight.
That is right, Sian. Yeah, of course, there is only one talking point today, the continuing fallout from Sir John Chilcot's Iraq report. In the last few minutes, Labour leader Jeremy Corbyn has apologised on behalf of the Labour Party for the decision to go to war. I've also been speaking to Alistair Campbell, who was one of Tony Blair's closest aides at the time. The Iraq War, what really happened, is on 5 News tonight at 6:30.
Thanks, Matt. That's it for now. Sian Welby has the weather next. I'll see you again tomorrow at 5. Thanks for watching tonight. Goodbye for now.